530 feet beneath Lake Superior, in water so cold that bodies never decompose, an underwater drone descended into the shattered pilot house of the Edmund Fitzgerald. The cameras captured what no human eye had ever seen: the helm frozen in time, gauges still mounted on walls, the captain's chair bolted to a deck that would never feel sunlight again. And in the twisted steel and scattered debris, the footage revealed something that contradicts everything we have been told about how 29 men died on a November night in 1975. For decades, the story seemed settled. A massive Great Lakes freighter caught in a storm, overwhelmed by waves, sinking so fast the crew never had time to radio a proper distress call. The largest ship ever lost on the Great Lakes, gone in minutes, taking every soul aboard to the bottom. Tragic, but explainable. An act of nature, an unavoidable disaster. Except the drone footage tells a different story. The images from inside the wreck show damage that should not exist if the ship simply succumbed to waves. They show evidence of catastrophic structural failure that the official investigation never fully explained. They show a pilot house that flooded from below, not from above. And they show a vessel that may have been doomed before the storm ever hit, carrying weaknesses that her crew never knew existed. The Edmund Fitzgerald was not just lost to the lake. She was lost to decisions made in boardrooms and shipyards years before her final voyage. And the underwater drones have finally brought the evidence to the surface. This is the story of what happened when technology reached the parts of the wreck that investigators could not access in 1976. This is what the cameras found inside the grave of 29 men. And this is why, after nearly 50 years, the families still do not have answers they can believe. The pride of the Great Lakes. When the Edmund Fitzgerald was launched on June 7, 1958, she was the largest ship on the Great Lakes. 729 feet of steel, designed to carry 26,000 tons of iron ore from the mines of Minnesota to the steel mills of Detroit and Cleveland. She was built by the Great Lakes Engineering Works in River Rouge, Michigan, at a cost of $8 million, an enormous sum for the era. The ship was named after the president and chairman of Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company, the company that financed her construction. At her christening, Mrs. Edmund Fitzgerald smashed the champagne bottle against the bow, but it took her 3 attempts. Some observers considered this an omen. Sailors are superstitious, and a difficult christening was never a good sign. But the Fitzgerald quickly proved herself. For 17 years, she carried ore across the lakes without serious incident. She set cargo records, earned respect from crews who served on her, and became a symbol of American industrial power. Her captain, Ernest McSorley, was a veteran of 44 years on the Great Lakes. He knew these waters as well as anyone alive. The crew that boarded the Fitzgerald on November 9, 1975, had no reason for concern. They were experienced men, most of them with decades on the lakes. The cook, the deckhands, the engineers, the watchmen, they knew the ship, they knew the job, and they knew the risks. November was always dangerous. The gales of November were legendary, storms that came howling out of the north, with waves that could break a ship in half. But the Fitzgerald was built for this. She had weathered November storms before. She would weather this one. The cargo manifest for that final voyage listed 26,116 tons of taconite pellets, a processed form of iron ore. The load was bound for Zug Island near Detroit. It was a routine run, one the Fitzgerald had made hundreds of times. The ship departed from Superior, Wisconsin on the afternoon of November 9th, steaming into a forecast that warned of rough weather ahead. Captain McSorley was not concerned. He had sailed through worse. The Fitzgerald was a tough ship, and his crew was experienced. As the big freighter pushed out into Lake Superior, nobody aboard could have known that within 30 hours, every one of them would be dead. And nobody could have imagined that 50 years later, underwater drones would descend into the wreckage and discover evidence suggesting that the Fitzgerald had been vulnerable in ways her own crew never suspected. November 10, 1975. The storm that hit Lake Superior on that day was not unusual for the time of year. The National Weather Service had issued gale warnings. Winds were forecast to reach 50 knots, with waves building to 15 feet. Captains on the lakes understood these conditions. They adjusted course, reduced speed, and kept their ships pointed into the wind. It was dangerous, but manageable. The Fitzgerald was not alone on the lake that day. Another freighter, the Arthur M. Anderson, was running a parallel course about 10 to 15 miles behind. The two captains stayed in radio contact throughout the day, sharing weather observations and position reports. This was standard practice. Ships on the Great Lakes operated as an informal fleet, looking out for each other when conditions turned rough. By early afternoon, the storm had intensified beyond the forecast. Winds were gusting to 60 knots. Waves were building past 20 feet. Both ships altered course to pass closer to the Canadian shore, seeking the relative shelter of shallower water near the Keweenaw Peninsula. This was a calculated risk. Shallower water meant smaller waves, but it also meant less room for error. At approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, Captain McSorley radioed the Anderson with troubling news. The Fitzgerald had sustained damage. She had a fence rail down, 2 vents lost or damaged, and she was taking on water. McSorley reported that the ship had developed a list. One of the ballast pumps was running to control the flooding, but the Fitzgerald was still making headway. The tone of the transmission was calm and professional. This was a problem, but not yet a crisis. The Anderson's captain, Jesse Cooper, asked if McSorley had his pumps going. McSorley confirmed that he did, both pumps. Cooper noted the response. Running both pumps meant the flooding was significant, but McSorley did not sound panicked. The Fitzgerald continued on course. Over the next few hours, the storm worsened. Waves were now estimated at 25 feet, possibly higher. The Fitzgerald and the Anderson pushed through the chaos, their crews working to keep the ships on course. At approximately 7:10 in the evening, the Anderson radioed the Fitzgerald with a routine position update. First Mate Morgan Clark asked if the Fitzgerald was checking down, slowing her speed to let the Anderson catch up. Captain McSorley's response would be the last words ever heard from the Edmund Fitzgerald: "We are holding our own." 10 minutes later, the Anderson's radar showed the Fitzgerald disappearing from the screen. At first, Cooper assumed the radar had malfunctioned, or that snow squalls were blocking the signal. He tried to raise the Fitzgerald on the radio. No response. He tried again. Still nothing. By 7:30, Cooper knew something was wrong. He contacted the Coast Guard and reported the Fitzgerald missing. The search began immediately, but conditions were brutal. Waves were still running at 25 feet. Visibility was near zero. The Coast Guard dispatched helicopters and cutters. But in the darkness and the storm, finding anything would be nearly impossible. By dawn on November 11th, the search crews had found debris. Life jackets, life rafts, pieces of the ship's superstructure. But no survivors. No bodies. No sign of the crew. The Edmund Fitzgerald had vanished in one of the deepest parts of Lake Superior, taking 29 men with her. The largest ship ever lost on the Great Lakes had sunk so fast that the crew never had time to launch a lifeboat or send a proper distress signal. Within hours, the Fitzgerald became a ghost story, a legend, a mystery that would haunt the Great Lakes for generations. And within months, investigators would begin the long process of trying to understand what had happened. Their conclusions would satisfy some, but for the families of the 29 dead, and for anyone who studied the evidence closely, the official story would raise more questions than it answered. The first discovery. The search for the Edmund Fitzgerald's wreck began within days of her disappearance. The United States Navy deployed the Kerr V-3, a remotely operated vehicle capable of operating at depths beyond human reach. On November 14th, just 4 days after the sinking, the Kerr V located the wreck in 530 feet of water, roughly 17 miles northwest of Whitefish Point, Michigan. The initial sonar scans showed the ship broken in 2 massive sections lying close together on the lake bottom. The bow section was upright and relatively intact. The stern section was upside down and badly damaged. Between them lay a debris field scattered with pieces of the ship, cargo, and equipment. The discovery confirmed what everyone feared. The Fitzgerald had suffered a catastrophic structural failure. She had not simply capsized or slowly flooded. She had broken apart. In May 1976, the United States Navy returned with more sophisticated equipment. The QRV-3 was deployed again, this time with better cameras and lighting. The footage captured images that would become iconic. The bow section rising from the lake floor, her anchor still secured, her name still visible on the hull. The stern section was twisted and crumpled, barely recognizable as part of a ship. And scattered across the bottom were the personal effects of 29 men who never came home. The Coast Guard's Marine Board of Investigation convened to examine the evidence and determine the cause of the sinking. Testimony was taken from Captain Cooper of the Anderson, from Coast Guard personnel, from naval architects, and from experts in Great Lakes shipping. The board reviewed weather data, examined pieces of wreckage recovered from the surface, and studied the underwater footage. Their conclusion, released in 1977, blamed the sinking on massive flooding caused by the loss of hatch covers. The theory went like this. The Fitzgerald's cargo hold was divided into compartments covered by large steel hatch covers secured with clamps. If these covers were damaged or improperly secured, water could enter the hold during heavy seas. Once the hold began flooding, the ship would lose buoyancy and sink rapidly. The board concluded that this was the most likely scenario. But the families of the crew did not accept this explanation. They pointed out that the hatch covers were inspected before every voyage. They noted that Captain McSorley had not reported any issues with the hatches during his final radio transmissions, and they questioned how a ship could sink so fast from flooding cargo holds when she was designed with watertight bulkheads to prevent exactly that kind of catastrophe. The Lake Carriers Association, representing the shipping industry, also disagreed with the Coast Guard's findings. They commissioned their own study, which concluded that the Fitzgerald had most likely struck the bottom in shallow water near Caribou Island, damaging her hull and allowing catastrophic flooding. This theory suggested that the ship had been off course, that she had ventured into dangerously shallow water without realizing it, and that she had paid the price. Neither theory fully explained the evidence. Neither theory accounted for the condition of the wreck as seen in the underwater footage. And neither theory would be definitively proven until decades later, when technology advanced enough to explore the interior of the wreck itself. For nearly 20 years, the Edmund Fitzgerald rested undisturbed on the lake bottom. The wreck was designated a protected site. Diving was prohibited without special permission. The families wanted the site treated as a grave, and most authorities agreed. But the questions persisted. What had really sunk the Fitzgerald? Had the crew made a mistake? Had the ship failed them? Or had something else gone wrong? Something that nobody in 1975 had the tools to discover. If you are still here, you now understand that 29 men died in minutes with no time to escape, and that 2 official investigations could not agree on what killed them. Comment 2 below if you are following this investigation. And if you have not subscribed, please do so and turn on the bell notification so you do not miss what comes next. Your support helps us preserve these stories that official reports left incomplete. Now, let us see what the underwater drones finally revealed when they went inside the wreck that no human could reach. What the drones revealed. In 1989, the first major expedition to thoroughly document the Edmund Fitzgerald returned to the wreck site. The expedition was led by the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society, and it brought technology that had not existed in 1976. A remotely operated vehicle equipped with high-definition cameras, powerful lights, and manipulator arms capable of recovering small artifacts descended to the wreck. The remotely operated vehicle spent hours methodically filming every accessible section of the ship, the bow section, the stern section, and the debris field between them. For the first time, researchers could see details that the grainy 1976 footage had missed. The pilothouse windows were intact. The anchors were still in place. The masts were still standing, but the stern section told a different story. The entire aft portion of the ship had been destroyed with such violence that the steel was folded back on itself. In 1994, another expedition returned with even more advanced equipment. This time, the remotely operated vehicle was equipped with sonar imaging systems that could penetrate the interior spaces of the wreck. The goal was to map the cargo holds, the engine room, and the crew quarters. What the scans revealed was disturbing. The cargo hold was not simply flooded, it had been crushed. The hatch covers that the Coast Guard had blamed for the sinking were found scattered in the debris field, but they showed no signs of having failed before the sinking. The clamps were still in place on several covers. The covers themselves were undamaged except where the ship had broken apart. The evidence suggested the covers had been torn off by the violence of the breakup, not by waves during the storm. The engine room told another part of the story. The massive diesel engines were still in place, but the room itself had flooded from above, not from below. Water had entered through the rupture where the ship broke in half, pouring down into the engineering spaces and trapping anyone who might have been working there. The boilers showed no signs of explosion. The fuel tanks had not ruptured. Whatever had sunk the Fitzgerald, it was not an engineering casualty. But the most revealing footage came in 1995, when an expedition was finally granted permission to send a remotely operated vehicle into the pilot house itself. This was the command center of the ship, where Captain McSorley and his officers had spent the final hours trying to save their vessel. The pilot house was largely intact, though tilted at an angle. The cameras captured images that would haunt everyone who saw them. The ship's wheel was still in place. The throttle controls were set to full ahead. The captain's chair was bolted to the deck, empty now, but positioned exactly where McSorley would have been sitting when the ship went down. The navigation instruments were still mounted on the walls, their faces dark, but readable. And most chilling of all, the portholes showed no signs of having been smashed by waves. They were intact, their glass unbroken. If the Fitzgerald had been overwhelmed by a rogue wave, if water had poured over the deck and into the pilot house, those windows should have been shattered. Instead, they were whole. The evidence suggested the pilot house had flooded from below, rising water filling the compartment as the ship sank bow first into the lake. The 2006 expedition brought the most sophisticated technology yet deployed on the wreck. The remotely operated vehicle was equipped with three-dimensional scanning systems, high-resolution cameras, and robotic arms capable of precise manipulation. The goal was to conduct a comprehensive forensic examination of the entire wreck site, documenting every detail that might explain what had happened. The scans revealed structural damage that had never been properly examined. The bow section showed evidence of severe stress fractures along the keel, the spine of the ship. These fractures suggested that the Fitzgerald had suffered a structural failure, that she had broken apart not because of flooding, but because the hull itself had failed under stress. The pattern of damage was consistent with a ship that had sagged in the middle, her bow and stern supported by waves, while her midsection hung unsupported over a trough. The weight of the cargo, 26,000 tons of iron ore, would have concentrated enormous stress on the weakest point of the hull. The hull had snapped. The stern section showed even more disturbing evidence. The entire aft portion of the ship had been peeled open like a tin can. The deck plates were bent backward, exposing the interior compartments. The propeller shaft was twisted. The rudder was jammed hard over, suggesting the ship had been turning when she went down. This matched Captain McSorley's final transmission about checking down for the Anderson. The Fitzgerald had been slowing and turning to let the other ship catch up. The maneuver may have put additional stress on an already weakened hull, but the most significant finding came from examining the debris field. Among the scattered cargo and equipment, the remotely operated vehicle found pieces of the ship's bottom plating. These steel plates, which should have been attached to the underside of the hull, were lying separate from the main wreck sections. The edges of the plates showed no sign of tearing. Instead, They had separated at the seams, suggesting that the rivets and welds holding them in place had simply failed. The implications were staggering. The Edmund Fitzgerald may have been taking on water not because of damaged hatch covers or a collision with the bottom, but because her hull was literally coming apart under the stress of the storm. The flooding that Captain McSorley reported may have been caused by seams opening up along the bottom of the ship, allowing water to pour into the cargo hold from below. Inside the wreck. The interior footage captured by the remotely operated vehicles revealed details that no investigator in 1976 could have accessed. The pilot house, the crew quarters, the galley, and all frozen in time, preserved by the cold water and the depth. These were not just mechanical spaces. They were the places where 29 men had lived and worked, the last places they had been alive. The pilot house sat at the forward part of the bow section, elevated above the main deck. When the vehicle entered through the shattered windows on the port side, the cameras showed a room that appeared almost ready for service. The helm was centered in front of large windows that once offered a panoramic view of the lake. The throttle controls stood to the right of the wheel. Navigation charts were still mounted on the walls, though the paper had long since dissolved. The captain's chair, a heavy steel seat bolted to the deck, remained in position. Captain McSorley would have been sitting here when the Fitzgerald began her final plunge. The throttle position showed the engines had been running at full power. He had not shut them down. He had not ordered abandon ship. The evidence suggested he had been caught completely by surprise. The instrument panels told their own story. The depth finder, the compass, the radio equipment, all still mounted where they had been installed decades earlier. The radio microphone hung from its cord, swaying slightly in the current. This was the microphone that McSorley had used to transmit his final words. "We are holding our own." 7 words that would become his epitaph. The crew quarters were located in the forward section of the ship, below the pilot house. The vehicle descended through the corridors, its lights illuminating spaces that had been dark for decades. Bunks were still bolted to the walls. Lockers stood open, their contents long since scattered or dissolved. Personal effects were scattered across the deck, items that had once belonged to the men who slept here. Photographs, clothing, books, all gradually disintegrating in the cold water. The galley, where the crew took their meals, remained recognizable. Tables were still secured to the deck. The stove sat against one wall, its burners cold forever. Dishes and utensils lay scattered where they had fallen when the ship went down. The cook, Robert Rafferty, had been preparing dinner when the Fitzgerald sank. He never served it. The debris field between the bow and stern sections was perhaps the most haunting part of the wreck. Here, scattered across the lake bottom, were the pieces of the ship that had been torn away when she broke apart. Sections of railing, pieces of the smokestack, cargo hatch covers, life jackets still in their racks because the crew never had time to deploy them. And, among the debris, more personal effects. A boot, a life ring with the ship's name still visible, fragments of clothing. The remotely operated vehicle cameras captured images of items that told stories about the men who had died here. A thermos bottle, still intact. A hard hat with a name stenciled on the front. A wooden crate that had once held tools. Each item represented a life, a person who had boarded the Fitzgerald on November 9th, expecting to be home within a few days. The stern section, lying upside down, was more difficult to examine. The violence of the sinking had crushed the aft portion of the ship almost beyond recognition. The entire superstructure had collapsed. The smokestack had been torn away. The propeller, which should have been spinning at the time of the sinking, was partially buried in the sediment. The rudder showed severe damage, bent and twisted by forces that were hard to comprehend. When the vehicle finally accessed the engine room, it confirmed what the exterior damage suggested. The space had flooded catastrophically. The diesel engines, massive machines that had powered the Fitzgerald for 17 years, sat silent and corroded. The control panels were dark. The gauges were frozen. Everything in this space had happened so fast that the engineering crew likely never understood what was killing them. But the most disturbing images came from the cargo hold itself. The taconite pellets that the Fitzgerald had been carrying were still visible, scattered across the lake bottom and piled inside the broken hull. 26,000 tons of iron ore, the cargo that had paid for this voyage, had become ballast, dragging the ship to the bottom. The hold showed signs of catastrophic flooding, but the sequence was now clear. Water had entered from below, through seams that had failed under stress. The cargo had shifted as the ship listed, adding more stress to an already failing structure. And then, the hull had snapped, breaking the ship in two and sending both sections to the bottom in minutes. The crew had never stood a chance. From the moment the hull began to fail, their fate was sealed. There was no time to launch lifeboats, no time to radio a proper distress call, no time to do anything except hold on as their world came apart around them. The theories collapse. The underwater drone footage systematically dismantled every theory that had been offered to explain the sinking. The official Coast Guard conclusion blamed damaged hatch covers. But the covers found in the debris field were intact, their clamps still in place. They had been ripped off when the ship broke apart, not lost to waves during the storm. The theory that the Fitzgerald struck bottom near Caribou Island also failed. Ships that run aground show scraping and impact damage to the keel. The Fitzgerald showed longitudinal fractures, stress breaks running the length of the hull. This was not collision damage. This was structural failure. The rogue wave theory collapsed under the same scrutiny. The pilothouse windows were intact. The deck structures showed no impact damage. If a massive wave had overwhelmed the ship, the evidence would be obvious. It was not there. What the drones revealed was simple and damning. The Edmund Fitzgerald broke apart because her hull failed under stress. 17 years of carrying 26,000-ton loads had caused metal fatigue. The long, narrow design made her vulnerable to hogging and sagging in rough seas. Modifications over the years had weakened her further, and on November 10, 1975, in a storm she should have survived, the steel finally gave way. The ship did not fail her crew. The industry failed them both. The grave that still speaks. The wreck site of the Edmund Fitzgerald is now protected under law. Diving is prohibited. The site is designated a maritime grave, but that protection came too late to prevent artifact removal. The ship's bell was recovered and now resides at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum, where it is rung 29 times each November 10th. A replacement bell bearing the crew's names was placed on the wreck. For the families, the drone footage provided the answers they had sought for decades. But those answers confirmed what many suspected. The ship was flawed. The system failed. And no one was ever held accountable. Gordon Lightfoot's song ensured the Fitzgerald would never be forgotten, but it also cemented narratives that the drone footage has now challenged. The question that haunts the investigation is simple. Could the sinking have been prevented? If structural weaknesses had been detected and repaired, would the Fitzgerald have survived? 530 feet beneath Lake Superior, the wreck rests in pieces. The drones have shown us the pilothouse where Captain McSorley stood in his final moments. They have shown us the structural failures that investigations tried to minimize. And they have confirmed what the families always knew. The Edmund Fitzgerald was not claimed by nature. She was betrayed by invisible flaws in her steel, by decisions that prioritized profit over safety. The lake keeps its secrets, but the drones have revealed enough.